Hello, and welcome back to Owens Bay. Over the last 6 episodes, we've spent some time bringing the city of New Sunderland up to speed with the rest of the region, and I think it's looking pretty good. I also think it might be time to move on to newer projects. But before we move on, we have one last little project left to do down here, and that is a little bit of suburban sprawl up until the hillside on the other side of the highway, right down here. And something a little extra as well. My name is Geifs, and let's get started. Okay, so what we're going to be focusing on is the area right down below us here. This little annoying little divot or whatever this is like a little hillside here, and I've been having trouble filling this in right from the very beginning. It's going to become the crossing point for access into a new suburban development on the other side of the highway here. And we're just going to spend a bit of time making the road access for it. Now, like I said in the intro, I think we're kind of reaching the point of with New Sunderland where it feels pretty much finished. Obviously, there's always going to be more work to be done. There's a lot of things that still need to be done. I need to switch out, and what it mostly is just switching out old buildings for new buildings. To be honest, I can't think of any way to make that into an interesting episode, so I think a lot of that is going to happen off camera. But this area here definitely needs to be finished before I move on, so that's what we're going to be doing for this episode. I'm going to be creating a little highway interchange right here. It's nothing too fancy. I'm not really anticipating this to be a high traffic area, so the highway connections here are going to be pretty simple. When I first drew out the roads for New Sunderland, I did this weird little bend in the road here to try to highlight the hill, but what it created was this extremely awkward little area where I couldn't think of anything proper to put in there, or at least nothing seemed to fit. I'm going to be using a lot of the new buildings from the Southwest pack to fill in this area. I'm just going to add a little bit of extra parking here for the high school. And I have this very awkward area in here, so we're just going to try to fit in the parking as best we can and make a bit of a custom parking lot. Okay, the suburban sprawl up into the hillside. So we're going to get rid of a few of the trees. And because the buildings in City Skylines 2 don't interact with the hills very well, we have to do this as a series of plateaus carving into the hillside. Just like how I do everything, I just jump around all over the place here without any real focus. But we'll come back to that a little later. This area in here is a bit of a transition area. It allows for very quick, easy access to downtown New Sunderland. And it also is a crossover point into the suburban hills. It's also a bit of an awkward area for development. I have to spend a lot of time in here just plopping buildings and shuffling them around to get them to fit as best as possible. I'm going to use pedestrian paths here with the key wall to create these kind of a stepped area where the buildings creep up the hillside. This is the only way I can get this to work without the terrain looking really strange. The Southwest Pack has quite a few buildings in it that are very useful for this particular build in the Pacific Northwest. They fit in just perfect. It's just a matter of searching through them and trying to find the ones that will work the best. Unfortunately, in the Find It tool, we don't actually have images for these buildings yet, so it's a bit of a hit or miss, like you have to pick your way through it. But I'm quite happy with the buildings. They look outstanding. I especially love these commercial fast food type buildings. They are quite fun. What I'm looking for here are buildings of a particular style and a particular size. Everything right in here would be a fairly new development, new being in the last, say, 30 to 40 years. It might have been in the past, it might have been just some, a collection of houses up on the hill, but once the connections to the highway were built here, it all built up to a little bit more density. So that's what I'm trying to capture here. I'm going to zone the area and let some of the buildings just grow in and see what I get. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. For this particular build, it didn't really work too well. I think I have to come back in here and switch out most of the buildings to something a little more suitable. But you never know. Also, letting things just zone in naturally, sometimes you get interesting combinations of buildings that you might not necessarily pick yourself, and it makes for a more interesting looking neighborhood sometimes. I'm going to be splicing buildings together to fill in some of the more awkward spots. There are a fair number of awkward areas in here, and if I just relied on the zoning, it wouldn't look very good, so I have to use Move It to shuffle the buildings around, splice a few of them together, that sort of thing. And like I was saying, the way the buildings interact with the terrain, you have to do it in this kind of terraced kind of approach, otherwise it just won't look very good. I do apologize if you happen to hear crows in the background. There's a crow's nest right outside my window, and it's getting to that time of year, and they are going to be noisy for a few months. The next few months, they're going to be rather noisy, unfortunately, and there isn't really much I can do about it. How I'm imagining this little area in here is there's some residential developments that have a little bit of height to them, so people get these amazing views of downtown New Sutherland, but I also don't want them to be too high that they're blocking views from everybody behind them. So I'm kind of looking for the right height for buildings in here. I'm also moving the buildings a bit back from the road. That way I can control how they line up. If you just let everything zone directly to the road, obviously everything just follows the road, but that's not necessarily how buildings sometimes go. So setting them back a little bit, giving them a little more room, I can place them a little more exactly how I want them. Also, I can splice them together like I just did here. I'm also going to be using a few just of the vanilla buildings. I think they're still quite fine. Obviously, just having a bit more variety to the buildings, so we're not so overly saturated with the vanilla ones, is great. And I'm going to use them where I can. I think they're still quite useful. find I don't really have much to say about any of it's just, your typical suburban sprawl. There's nothing really special about it in the sense that the only thing I'm trying to do here is fit it all together in a way that makes sense and also try to make it feel like a bit of a unique neighborhood. It's rather tricky to do. It's just mostly just surfaces and trees and stuff to tie it all together. I'm using a few prop buildings to add a bit of interest to some of these really awkward shaped lots that I can't actually get proper road access into. And I'm going to fill most of these areas in with little parking lots and stuff. Okay, right down here, we're gonna replace some of these residential houses with the new row homes from the Southwest Pack. These are great. This style of row home really fits this region very well. Much better than the vanilla set. And I've seen the ones from the East Coast set. Those are really, really nice. And there's quite a few buildings in the East Coast set that would work very well in the little fishing village of Owens Bay. I will have to revisit that at some point and swap out a few buildings. And we can see how it sits on the skyline here. I think this looks quite nice. It also makes for some very wonderful flyovers of the whole section of town. I really do have to come back in here and switch out a lot of these houses for newer ones. But that's just like really busy work, and there's just no way I can make that into an interesting episode. So like I said, that's going to happen pretty much off camera. Okay, into the suburban sprawl up into the hillside. This was, like I said, tricky to do because of the slope of the hill. There isn't a really good way to do this, so it requires a lot of terraforming and essentially flattening out the areas where you want the houses to be, and then coming back in with the terraforming tools to smooth everything out and to make it look like it all belongs. Also, it does kind of require a lot of trees to disguise more of the awkward transitions in the landscape. But trees is what this area is all about, so that's not an issue. It'd be a lot harder if this was an environment where there were far less trees. My thinking here is, obviously there's going to be a fair amount of development up on the hillside that's going to try to take advantage of the spectacular views of downtown, which are quite lovely from up here. But the trade-off is, it is right on top of the highway, so it's very noisy. So that combination kind of leads to a very specific type of development. It's not super high end because of the noise from the highway, but it's also rather expensive just because of the view. It's a bit of a paradox of sorts. Okay, up here what I'm going to be doing is putting in a reservoir. I've been having water supply issues. I have put in a couple of emergency water towers, but water towers aren't really in this region. There's so much water falling out of the sky that it's usually just collected in surface reservoirs, which is what I'm going to build up here right near the top. I also thought it would be fun to include something a little bit fun right at the very top of the hill up here. Just smoothing out some of the locations for things I want to build up here. This is all going to be fairly low detail for the most part. It is just suburban sprawl right at the very edge of town. So way up in the hills, I thought it'd be fun to put something a little special. So we're going to be using the Geological Research Station, or Institute, I suppose, which makes perfect sense in the Pacific Northwest, being an earthquake-prone area. There would probably be such a thing. I'm also going to place down the satellite dish. Now, I think this is kind of an underused asset. This actually gives you bonus to your university education or university interest of 15%. I am going to only use one real one though, and use props for the other three. I mean, I could use all four of them. I could put down real buildings for all four, but that would drastically distort my university education, which, depending on if you had a certain type of build in mind, you might want to do that. At first, I didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time building out this area, and so I thought I would zone in the buildings. Like I said earlier, sometimes zoning out buildings leads to interesting surprises. Unfortunately, in this case, it really didn't. And what zoned in was not great. I'm putting in a few service buildings up here. I don't really want to, but because this area is a bit remote from the rest of town, if I don't do this, it's all going to burn down or other things are going to happen up here. So I do need to include some. So yeah, for the commercial development right along the highway, what zoned in didn't really work all that well. I also forgot to put in a lot of surface parking, which is just a trademark of this sort of type of development. So I have to come back in here and shuffle things around and switch buildings out and put down proper parking as well. For most of this build, I really wasn't particularly happy with how this area was turning out. It just seemed extremely awkward. And didn't really make a lot of sense. But once I got the buildings I wanted in the locations I wanted and put in all the parking lots, drew in all the surfaces, it started to come together and it started to make a little more sense. But there was this really awkward part of the build where nothing really made any sense down here. And I have to admit, I struggled for this one a bit. For the most part, I'm using the buildings from the Southwest set, a few vanilla buildings and a few of the Japanese buildings as well. As I'm building this out, I'm trying to imagine what this sort of development by the side of the highway would look like. They're fairly common throughout all of North America, so you don't really have to think too hard about it. You just have to imagine, okay, what would this look like if I'm driving by it on the highway? I'm imagining all these buildings popped up around the same time as one kind of development. So the landscaping is kind of the same throughout the entire neighborhood. I'm also going to spend a bit of time on surfaces around it to just try to blend it in a little better. It's at this point where the neighborhood really starts coming together. It's hard to explain, but it's the trees that actually make it feel correct. Like that view right there, that is exactly what I was hoping to get. I spend a bit of time spacing out the suburban homes a bit. I'm not going to focus too much on this particular part of the build. It's not that important. I don't spend a lot of time detailing it. I'm just aiming for a particular type of density to the whole area. At this particular intersection here, I thought maybe add a bit more detail to it. What might pop up at this sort of intersection in this sort of neighborhood? Of course, I'm thinking a gas station. And I'm going to use the kindergarten from the Chinese set. The great thing about this building is it actually acts as a park. So it actually improves everybody's well-being. And I think it's a really cool looking asset. Also, you could strip away all the fencing and playground equipment and probably splice this into other buildings to get a park bonus where you might not expect there to be a park, which is also something I'm going to have to play around with a bit. I'm also going to include a convenience store, coffee shop, and a couple of offices. And I'm going to fit in parking wherever I can. The main purpose of this neighborhood is not necessarily to be anything special by itself. It's really backdrop for the downtown of New Sunderland. So when I'm trying to do cinematic shots of the city, this is, sprawling off the hillside. So it's not really an area where I'm probably never going to come back to this area or look at it again after this. Also, it's a bit unfinished, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Having areas that are not necessarily completely finished gives you the opportunity to come back to add things at a future date. If something pops into your head like that would look really amazing up there, I can come up into this area and build it out without feeling too hesitant about destroying what's already here or altering things. So it's plus and minuses to that sort of thing. And those two developments there, the highway side commercial area and that little crossroads, that's the main focus of the suburban development. Everything else up here is just more or less filler. I am going to come through here. The level 1 buildings that zoned in are, they're a little too repetitive, so I'm going to come in, take some of them out and replace them with higher level buildings just to give them a bit more variety to what's here. And it's a bit of those awkward areas, like I was saying, where you have amazing views of downtown, but you also have the highway. So do you want the trees to block the sound from the highway, or do you want the view? It's a tough question. Okay, right along the highway, we're going to put in a bit more density. We're going for medium density here. And I'm going to mix up I'm going to use some of the UK buildings and a few of the Eastern European ones as well, just to give it a bit more variety. As we move farther up the hillside, the houses are going to get larger. So for up here, I'm going to start using the buildings from the UK set. I'm going to be using surfaces here to tie all these satellite dishes together. I'm not going to keep this road. I'm just using it as an outline so I can trace in the surfaces. It makes drawing in the surfaces and drawing in this fence here much easier. I'm also going to be placing a few static assets here to play the role of offices for the satellite vis. And the last thing left to do is to fill in the area with trees. Most of the area up here is just going to be virgin forest, so I gotta pack it in pretty dense. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode. If you stuck around to the end, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And I'm excited for upcoming projects in the future. I have some hopefully things that are a little more interesting than this one. I know it might not have been the most exciting episode. Anyway, thank you once again for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode. Bye.